On a late June evening, a father named John and his 12-year-old son Elijah came to visit Grandpa Henry. Old Man Henry lived at the edge of a thick forest next to the wide Old Crow River. This house had stood there for over 70 years. Grandpa was stubborn and sturdy, and still kept up his strength in spite of his age. He gathered his own wood from the forest, stoked the stove, and cooked his own meals. As they unloaded their things, Grandpa Henry said, "This river remembers more than you and me, John. Maybe even more than all of us put together." The next morning, the trio went fishing. The weather was sunny and there was no wind. Grandpa led them to his favorite spot. It was a bend in the river where the depth was greater, but the water flowed more quietly. Old cypress trees grew on one side. Their roots reached toward the river as if they wanted to drink the water. Here, Henry said, was where the bite was always good. "I'll tell you something," he began, laying out his tackle. "There's a reason this river is called Old Crow. The Cherokee Indians gave is that name. Legend has it that when the whites came here, the raven spirit left the woods and went into the water. Since then, he has been watching for anyone who dares to disturb her peace." Elijah listened with interest. He loved mysticism and scary stories. John laughed at Henry's words and brushed them off. "Dad, you've always been superstitious. The fish are biting and that's fine. However," Grandpa went on, "I once saw water breathe. One day it was foggy, and suddenly a shadow rose from the river. It looked like a man, but it was not a man. The shadow had no face or hands, just a silhouette. And then the shadow disappeared, leaving only circles on the water. Elijah stared at the river, at its smooth surface, and seemed to turn a little pale. John only grinned. The fish were indeed biting. They caught trout and bass and made a fire right on the bank. While the fish were roasting, Henry's grandfather told another story. "In 1923, a woman drowned here," he began. "They said she was swept away by the current. However, the old people say she heard someone's voice. Someone called her out of the water, and she went off the bank into the river. Since then, at night, whispers have been heard on the river." "And what? You heard it yourself?" Elijah asked. "Once. A long time ago, but I don't come here at night anymore. That river has taken too many innocent people." They returned home toward evening. The house was filled with the smell of fresh fish, pine trees, and a slight sadness. Grandfather was the first to go to bed. John sat by the fireplace and read a book, while Elijah looked out the window at the river. He hoped to see something strange, mystical, and he did. There was a shadow on the other bank. It was a figure, as if made of mist. It was indistinct, but definitely human. Its outline resembled a tall, thin man. It didn't move, it just stared. The boy froze. Then, the figure took a step back and disappeared, as if dissolved. He ran to his father. He told John what he had seen. However, John only sighed tiredly and said, "It could have been a hunter, or just a shadow from a tree. Go to bed." Elijah didn't sleep at night. Something disturbed him, either the sound of the water or the strange feeling that he was being watched. The next morning was overcast, and silence hung in the air. When John woke up, he knew immediately. Something was wrong. The house was quiet, too quiet. Elijah was still asleep, curled up under a thin blanket. John stepped out onto the porch and saw that the door to Grandpa Henry's room was ajar. He knocked, then pushed it open. Henry was on the bed, arms folded calmly across his chest, eyes closed. His face seemed frozen in tension, as if he had seen something before he died. The doctor, who came from the nearest village, shook his head and said, "Heart." He was old, John. Probably happened at night. He went quietly. However what? John asked. "You say he went to bed. As usual? No complaints?" "Absolutely. We ate fish. He was as awake as ever." Suddenly, John remembered Grandpa sat at the window for a long time that night, looking out at the river, like he was mesmerized. He had an expression on his face," the doctor continued, "like he'd seen something he shouldn't have seen. Henry was buried on a small hill by the woods, as he had willed. The grave faced the river." John read the words of farewell. Elijah stood silent, fists clenched. After the funeral, they got in the car and drove away. Grandpa's house remained empty, slowly overgrown with moss and silence. "It's been a year. I think we should go there," John said one day. "In memory of Grandpa. He'd want us to go fishing again." Elijah was a year older now, and he agreed to his father's suggestion. He remembered those days too. He remembered the river. He remembered the shadow on the shore. However, he didn't tell his father. They arrived at the end of July. Everything was almost the same as it had been a year before. The house stood a silent guard at the edge of the forest. Inside, it smelled of dust and old pine trees. "Everything is just as it was," John said quietly, opening the windows. They walked to the bend in the river, where the three of them had sat a year ago. The water was calm, very calm. No ripples, no fish splashing. "Dad, it's weird," Elijah said, staring at the smooth, mirror-like surface. It was like the river wasn't breathing. They sat there all day. Didn't catch a single fish. John tried to joke, but his smile was strained. There were too many memories of that place. As the sun began to set, they silently wrapped up their gear and returned home, empty, tired, and a little annoyed. The house greeted them with a chill. They ate a canned dinner and went to bed early. Elijah didn't fall asleep right away. Again, that strange feeling that someone was watching. In the night, they heard sounds. First, a rustling on the veranda. Then, a creaking wooden floorboards, as if someone had entered the house. John jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and turned it on. Elijah woke up almost at the same time as his father. His heart was racing. "Someone's in there," the boy whispered. They walked down the hallway. It was silent. Everything locked, doors locked, windows shut. "Maybe a beast," John muttered, "or just a draft." That night, they did not sleep. They listened to every sound. The house was quiet until morning, in the morning. However, they were in for a surprise. Inside the house, near the front door, neatly laid out, were trout and bass, fresh. The water drops glistened on the scales of the fish. Nearby was Henry's fishing rod, his box of hooks, his old hat, and at the very entrance, there were muddy boots, wet, with black mud on the soles, like someone had come out of the water and walked through the woods, and then walked into the house and left the fishing rod and the catch by the front door. "That's impossible," John whispered. He checked all the doors. The locks were untouched. No sign of forced entry. "Is this someone's prank?" he said aloud, as if hoping to convince himself. Elijah stood looking at the boots. He knew it wasn't a prank. "It's him," the boy said quietly. "Grandfather. He's come back. He was fishing. For us." John turned sharply, about to say something. At that moment, there was a whisper outside the door, on the riverside. It was as if someone had called his name, and for a moment, Elijah thought he heard his grandfather's voice. The day passed in tense silence. They didn't dare put away the catch, didn't touch the tackle. In the evening, John and Elijah heard footsteps again, the creaking of wooden floorboards. Through the opening in the door, they saw a shadow, a tall one, a human one. It stood, and then slowly stepped back and disappeared. John said, We're leaving right now." As they walked to the car, Elijah looked back. Standing by the river in the fog was Henry's grandfather, and beside him, a shadow, tall, almost transparent, like a man out of the water. They hadn't been back to Grandpa Henry's house on the Old Crow River since. However, 3 years later, John received a letter. No address, no signature. Inside was a yellowed photograph. Him, Elijah, and his grandfather against the backdrop of the river. And on the back, in neat, aged handwriting, "The river never forgets. I'm here for you."